My husband and his father did something I will never forget. What happens when a seemingly perfect marriage unravels under the weight of neglect and a forbidden connection becomes impossible to ignore? This is the story of a choice that changed everything, a choice between loyalty, desire, and the pursuit of true happiness. How far would you go to reclaim your life? Stick with me to the end to find out how it all unfolded, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories like this one. I'd also love to hear where you're watching from in the comments below. When Peter moved into our home, I never imagined he'd become the center of a secret that would change my life forever. I still remember the day he arrived. Mark, my husband, had made the arrangements, citing Peter's health and loneliness after the passing of his wife. It made sense logically. Our house was large, with a guest suite on the ground floor, and Peter didn't want to move into a retirement home. At least, that's what Mark said. But the truth was, Mark was rarely home. His work as a corporate executive consumed him, leaving me to handle most of the household responsibilities. Adding Peter to the mix felt like one more task on my already long list. I greeted him at the door that morning, feigning enthusiasm, as Mark helped his father carry a couple of suitcases inside. Peter looked every bit the distinguished gentleman, his gray hair neatly combed, a warm smile softening his sharp jawline. Despite his age, there was something magnetic about him, a presence that made you feel seen. "It's nice to see you again, Emma," Peter said, his voice steady and calm. He extended a hand but then pulled me into a hug instead. "Thank you for letting an old man invade your space." "It's no trouble at all," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. His cologne, a mix of cedarwood and something faintly sweet, lingered even after he pulled away. Mark barely stayed an hour after getting Peter settled in. He kissed me on the cheek, gave his father a brisk pat on the shoulder, and was out the door with his briefcase in hand. "Call if you need anything," he said, though he hadn't waited for a response. He never did. Left alone with Peter, I awkwardly offered him coffee. He accepted, following me into the kitchen and settling at the table. He looked around, taking in the space, and nodded approvingly. "You've done well with the place," he said. Mark always did have an eye for quality. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment to me or to Mark, but I thanked him anyway. As I busied myself at the counter, I could feel his eyes on me, not in a predatory way, but with a quiet curiosity that made me self-conscious. "You must be very patient," he said after a while. I turned to him, puzzled. "Excuse me?" "With Mark. He's dedicated to his work, isn't he?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. It wasn't a secret that Mark and I had been struggling. His long hours, the lack of intimacy, the growing distance between us. But it wasn't something I expected Peter to bring up. "He works hard," I said finally, a neutral answer. Peter nodded but said nothing more, leaving the conversation to hang in the air. Over the next few weeks, Peter and I fell into a comfortable routine. He spent most of his days reading or watching the news, occasionally helping me with small tasks around the house. Despite his age, he was remarkably agile, often insisting on carrying groceries or fixing things that Mark never got around to. I appreciated the help more than I let on. But it wasn't just the practical things. Peter had a way of making me feel noticed. Where Mark's attention was fleeting, often distracted by his phone or a looming deadline, Peter's was steady, intentional. He asked about my day and listened, really listened, to my answers. He complimented the meals I cooked, praised my taste in decor, and even commented on the books I left scattered around the living room. "You've got good taste in literature," he said one evening, picking up a novel I'd been reading. "I remember your wedding vows, how you quoted that line about love being patient and kind. I thought to myself, that's a woman who understands depth." I blushed, caught off guard by the memory. Mark had barely remembered the vows we'd written, stumbling through his lines with a nervous laugh. It was Peter who had helped him rehearse the night before, a detail I hadn't thought about in years. "Thank you," I said quietly, unsure what else to say. Peter smiled but didn't push the conversation further. Still, the warmth of his words lingered. It wasn't until Mark left for his first business trip after Peter moved in that things began to shift. The house felt different with just the two of us, quieter, more intimate. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way Peter's laugh filled the space, the way his presence seemed to ground the house in a way Mark's never did. One evening, as I was struggling to fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen, Peter appeared in the doorway. "Need a hand?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves before I could respond. Together, we managed to tighten the stubborn pipe. At one point, his hand brushed mine, and I felt a spark, not just of surprise, but of something I couldn't quite name. I glanced at him, wondering if he'd felt it too, but his expression was calm, focused on the task at hand. "Got it," he said finally, standing up and wiping his hands on a towel. He grinned, a boyish smile that seemed out of place on his otherwise weathered face. "Teamwork." "Liam, thanks," I said, my voice catching slightly. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the moment in my mind. It was nothing, I told myself, a touch, a shared accomplishment. But my heart betrayed me, beating just a little faster than it should. The next day, Peter offered to make dinner, a gesture that caught me off guard, but one I gladly accepted. He prepared a simple but elegant meal, lighting candles and pouring wine as if it were a special occasion. I sat across from him, feeling oddly self-conscious under his gaze. I gazed sightlessly into the lamplight, curled against my side, holding my hand. Then, "You deserve a little spoiling," he said with a wink, raising his glass. "To Emma, who keeps this house running like clockwork." I laughed, though his words left me flustered. As the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing, laughing at his stories, and even sharing a few of my own. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt seen, valued. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of confusion. Peter was my father-in-law. He was family. And yet, there was a warmth between us that felt different, dangerous. The days stretched into a rhythm that felt alarmingly natural. Peter's presence filled the gaps in the house, the silences that had once felt stifling when Mark was away. It wasn't just his help with chores or his stories at dinner. It was the way he paid attention to the smallest things. He noticed when I changed my hairstyle, complimented the new throw pillows I'd bought for the couch, and even remarked on how I'd rearranged the spice rack. Mark would never have noticed those things. He barely glanced up from his phone when he was home. But Peter? Peter noticed everything. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Peter came in carrying a box of old photographs he'd found while unpacking. He set it down on the coffee table and sat beside me, a little too close, but not close enough to be inappropriate. The faint scent of his cologne, cedar wood, and something warm, like amber, filled the air between us. "These are from when Mark was a boy," he said, pulling out a photo of a grinning child holding a fishing rod. "He loved the water back then. We used to spend whole summers at the lake." I smiled, taking the photo from him. I can't imagine Mark fishing. He's so corporate now. Oh, Peter chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made my stomach flutter. That's on me, I suppose. I pushed him to succeed, to build a life that was secure. But sometimes I wonder if I took away too much of his joy. The way he said it, with a tinge of regret, made my chest tighten. You did what you thought was best, I offered gently. He looked at me then, his eyes soft but searching. And what about you, Emma? Are you happy? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Was I happy? The answer felt too complicated to sum up in a single word. Peter seemed to sense my hesitation. He reached out, his hand brushing mine as he picked up another photo. You're an incredible woman, you know. Smart, capable, kind. Mark's lucky to have you. The compliment felt heavier than it should have, weighted with something unspoken. I glanced at him, my heart thudding as I noticed the way his gaze lingered. I cleared my throat, pulling my hand away. Thank you, Peter. That's kind of you to say. He nodded, but the moment lingered, a thread of tension weaving between us. I busied myself with the laundry, pretending not to notice the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long before he stood and left the room. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying every interaction with Peter over the past few weeks. The way his hand had brushed mine at the sink, the warmth in his eyes when he complimented me, the subtle but unmistakable attention he paid to every detail of my life. It wasn't just flattering, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt seen, desired. But it was wrong. Peter was Mark's father. This was a line that couldn't be crossed. I repeated that to myself over and over, as if the mantra could erase the feelings stirring in my chest. But the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they seemed to grow. The following weekend, Mark was scheduled to return home, and I busied myself with cleaning the house. Peter offered to help, insisting on vacuuming while I tackled the kitchen. At some point, I found myself scrubbing the countertops with more force than necessary, trying to work out the restless energy buzzing under my skin. You've been quiet today, Peter said, leaning against the doorway. He held a glass of water in one hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Something on your mind? The green leather laptop was propped on his knees. I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. Just a lot to do before Mark gets back. He stepped closer, setting the glass on the counter. Emma? His voice was soft, almost hesitant. If I've made you uncomfortable in any way. You haven't, I said quickly, cutting him off, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. He reached out then, his hand brushing my arm. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine. You can talk to me, you know, he said, about anything. I turned to face him fully, my chest tightening as our eyes met. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, he leaned in. Peter, I started, but the rest of the words caught in my throat as his lips brushed mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, and over almost as soon as it began. He pulled back, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I shouldn't have. I think you should go, I said, stepping back and wrapping my arms around myself. My voice was shaking, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him. Please. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course, he said, his voice laced with quiet resignation. I'll give you some space. As soon as he was gone, I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. My heart was pounding, and my lips still tingled from the kiss. What had just happened? How had I let it get this far? The next few days were a blur. Peter avoided me, spending most of his time in his room or out in the garden. I felt his absence acutely, even though I knew it was for the best. When Mark finally returned, I couldn't have been more relieved. His presence was a reminder of reality, a tether to the life I was supposed to be living. But even as I tried to immerse myself in our routine, I couldn't shake the memory of Peter's kiss. That evening, as Mark worked in his office, I found myself standing in the doorway to Peter's room. He was sitting in an armchair, a book in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" I asked. He nodded, setting the book aside. Of course. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The weight of the moment pressed down on me as I sat across from him. About the other day. I need to know that it won't happen again. He nodded again, his jaw tightening. You have my word. I'm deeply sorry for putting you in that position. Wow. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Thank you. I appreciate that. He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. Emma, I need you to know. It wasn't just a moment of weakness for me. I care about you, deeply, but I also understand that this is impossible. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to take it all back. But another part, a part I wasn't proud of, wanted to hear more. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, he said gently. I just needed you to know. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his confession hanging heavy between us. Finally, I stood, my legs feeling unsteady. Good night, Peter. Good night, Emma, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. As I left the room, I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end, or just the beginning of something I couldn't control. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Every time I walked past Peter's room or saw him in the living room, my chest tightened. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrent running through the house, fell back into his usual routine of long hours in his office and distracted conversations at dinner. He didn't notice how quiet I'd become, or the way Peter and I avoided each other's eyes. But avoidance wasn't enough. The memory of Peter's confession lingered, echoing in my mind at the most inconvenient times, while I cooked dinner, folded laundry, even as I lay next to Mark in bed. It wasn't just what he had said, but the way he had said it, the raw honesty in his voice. It had been years since anyone had looked at me that way, with such unguarded admiration. And then, one evening, everything unraveled. Mark had gone to bed early, exhausted after a grueling day of back-to-back meetings. I stayed up, unable to sleep, my thoughts a tangled web of guilt and longing. I wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water and found Peter there, sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe? Or regret? Couldn't sleep either, he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, hesitating in the doorway. I should have turned around and gone back to my room, but instead I stepped inside, the pull of his presence stronger than my better judgment. I've been thinking, Peter began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, about what I said the other night. I tensed, gripping the counter behind me. Peter, please. No, hear me out. He set the glass down and leaned forward, his elbows on the table. I know I said this was impossible, and I still believe that. But I also believe in being honest, and the truth is, Emma, I can't stop thinking about you. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Peter, this has to stop, I whispered. It's not fair to Mark. It's not fair to us. I know, he said softly, but fairness doesn't erase how I feel. And I think you feel it too. My breath caught, the truth of his statement cutting through me like a blade. I did feel it. That was the problem. Every time he looked at me, every time he spoke, a part of me longed to close the distance between us, to let myself be consumed by the warmth and attention I'd been missing for so long. But I couldn't say that. I can't, I said, shaking my head. I love Mark. Do you? His question was gentle, not accusatory, but it stung nonetheless. Or do you love the idea of him, the man you thought he was when you married him? Tears sprang to my eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. That's not fair, I said, my voice trembling. He stood then, closing the space between us in 2 strides. He stopped just short of touching me, his presence overwhelming. I'm not trying to hurt you, Emma. I'm trying to understand. And maybe I'm hoping you'll help me understand what we're doing here. I looked up at him, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. I don't know, I admitted, the words barely audible. For a moment we stood there, the air between us thick with tension, and then, as if drawn by a force greater than either of us, he reached out and cupped my face in his hands. Emma, he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But instead I leaned into his touch, the warmth of his palms grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When his lips met mine, it was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were giving me a chance to pull back. But I didn't. The kiss deepened, the world around us falling away. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, every rational thought drowned out by the flood of emotions coursing through me. For a few fleeting moments, nothing else mattered. Not Mark, not the consequences, not the gaping chasm of guilt I knew would follow. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. Peter rested his forehead against mine, his hands still on my waist. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have. Don't, I said, my voice shaky. Don't apologize. We stood there for a long moment, the gravity of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy fog. And then, without another word, I stepped back, putting distance between us. I need to go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Peter nodded, his expression unreadable. Good night, Emma. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and fled, my heart pounding as I climbed the stairs to my room. Mark was still asleep, his breathing steady and even. I slipped into bed beside him, my body trembling as the weight of what I'd done crashed over me. The next morning, I avoided Peter entirely, throwing myself into chores and errands to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of his touch, the way his lips had felt against mine. By the time Mark left for work, I was a bundle of nerves. I spent the day pacing the house, replaying every moment of the previous night in my mind. I knew I needed to talk to Peter, to set boundaries and figure out a way to move forward. But the thought of facing him again made my stomach twist. When I finally worked up the courage to knock on his door, he opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for me. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil he was feeling. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "Of course." I sat on the edge of the armchair while he stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. "What happened last night?" I began, struggling to find the right words. "It can't happen again." He took his time answering. "I know," he said quietly, "and I agree." His response surprised me, though it shouldn't have. Peter had always been the more rational of the two of us, the one who thought things through. But there was a sadness in his voice that made my chest ache. "I don't want to lose the friendship we've built," I continued, my voice trembling. "But we have to be careful, for Mark's sake." "For Mark's sake," he echoed, his tone heavy with resignation. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "Emma, I want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." His words hit me harder than I expected. "I know," I said softly. "And I appreciate that. But this, whatever this is between us, it has to end." Peter nodded, though the pain in his expression was undeniable. "I understand." I stood, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "for understanding." As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just closed the door on something I might never fully understand. Something that could have changed everything, for better or for worse. The following days were a quiet storm. Peter and I kept our interactions polite but distant, an unspoken agreement to maintain the delicate balance of the household. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling between us, carried on as usual, wrapped in his work, his attention flitting through me like I was nothing more than a shadow in his peripheral vision. It was a Saturday morning when the next crack appeared in the fragile facade we had built. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds, when Peter appeared, a cup of tea in his hand. "You've been out here for hours," he said, setting the cup on the stone ledge beside me. "Thought you could use a break?" "Thanks," I said without looking at him, focusing instead on the stubborn dandelion root I was wrestling from the earth. He crouched down beside me, his knees creaking slightly. For a moment, we worked in silence, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then he spoke, his voice quiet. "Emma, I think I should leave." The words hit me like a blow, sharp and unexpected. I turned to him, my hands still buried in the dirt. "This situation," he said, gesturing vaguely between us, "it's not fair to you or to Mark. I've overstayed my welcome." "You haven't overstayed anything," I said, my voice more forceful than I intended. "This is your son's house, Peter. You have every right to be here." He shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No, Emma, this is your house. You've made it a home, not Mark. And I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said, the words rushing out in a desperate attempt to keep him from leaving. "You've been nothing but helpful. This house feels better with you here." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't understand, Peter. You make me feel—" I stopped myself, biting my lip to keep from saying too much. "One more thing," I pressed to his lips. Peter's hand brushed mine, a soft, steadying gesture that made my chest tighten. "Emma, you deserve to be happy, truly happy. If my presence here is keeping you from that, then I need to go." I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Instead, I nodded, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on my chest. "When?" I managed to ask. "Next week," he said quietly. "I'll make arrangements." I nodded again, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll let Mark know." "No," he said firmly, "let me handle it. This is my decision." With that, he stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Finish your tea," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "You've earned it." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone in the garden with the weight of his decision pressing down on me like a heavy stone. The week leading up to Peter's departure was a blur of emotions. Mark barely noticed when Peter began packing his things, too preoccupied with an upcoming business trip to pay much attention. I, on the other hand, felt every moment like a wound being reopened. On Peter's last night in the house, Mark insisted on a family dinner. He was in high spirits, laughing and recounting stories from work, completely unaware of the tension crackling between Peter and me. "This house won't be the same without you, Dad," Mark said, raising his glass in a toast. "You've been a real lifesaver around here." He ignored him. Peter smiled, a polite but distant expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll miss being here," he said simply, his gaze flickering to me for the briefest of moments. I looked down at my plate, unable to meet his eyes. After dinner, Mark excused himself to take a call from work, leaving Peter and me alone in the kitchen. I busied myself with the dishes, the sound of running water filling the silence between us. "Thank you," Peter said suddenly, his voice soft. "For what?" I asked, not turning around. "For everything," he said, "for making me feel welcome, for being you." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the edge of the sink. "You don't have to thank me, Peter." "I do," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever feel again, and I'll always be grateful for that." I turned to him then, tears welling in my eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For everything." He shook his head, stepping closer. "Don't apologize, Emma. None of this is your fault." For a moment we stood there, the air between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. Then, without another word, he reached out and pulled me into a hug. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to shatter the fragile composure I'd been clinging to. I buried my face in his shoulder, the tears coming in silent waves as he held me close. When I finally pulled away, his hands lingered on my arms, his touch grounding me. "Take care of yourself, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When he tried to stand, I didn't move. "You too," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer before he stepped back. And just like that, he was gone. Yeah. The morning of Peter's departure, Mark left early for the airport, leaving me to say goodbye alone. I stood in the doorway as Peter loaded his suitcases into the back of a taxi, my heart aching with every step he took. When he turned to face me, his expression was calm, but his eyes were filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Goodbye, Emma," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Goodbye, Peter," I said, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, and climbed into the taxi. I watched as the car pulled away, the weight of his absence settling over me like a heavy blanket. The house felt impossibly quiet without him, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. For the rest of the day, I wandered from room to room, unable to shake the feeling that something vital had been ripped away. I tried to focus on chores, on anything that would distract me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Peter. His laugh, his warmth, the way he had looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. By the time evening came, I was emotionally spent. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, staring blankly at the television, the sound muted. The house felt empty, hollow, as if the walls themselves were mourning his absence, as if the vibrations from the photographs polluted those same vibrations. And then, just as I was beginning to think I couldn't bear the weight of it any longer, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Peter's name on the screen. "Peter, I'm here if you ever need someone to talk to." I stared at the message, my emotions swirling in a chaotic storm of longing and regret. I didn't know how to respond, or if I should respond at all. But as I sat there, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, I realized something. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Peter's message sat on my phone like an unspoken invitation. For hours I stared at it, my mind running circles around what it could mean. The simplicity of his words belied the weight they carried. He was offering a lifeline, a way to stay connected despite the distance he had imposed for both our sakes. I didn't respond that night. Instead, I curled up on the couch, staring into the darkened room, the faint glow of the phone screen my only companion. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with fragmented dreams of Peter's face, his voice, his touch. Without awakening, the following morning I woke with a heavy heart. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence almost oppressive. Mark was still away on his trip, and without Peter's presence, the loneliness pressed down on me like a physical weight. I busied myself with chores, anything to keep my hands occupied and my mind from wandering. But it was no use. By mid-afternoon, I found myself picking up my phone, rereading Peter's message for what felt like the 100th time. "Me, thank you. I might take you up on that someday." It was a small response, neutral enough to preserve the boundaries we had fought so hard to rebuild. But the moment I hit send, a rush of guilt flooded through me. What was I doing? Wasn't this just prolonging the inevitable? Minutes later, his reply came. "Peter, I hope you do take care of yourself, Emma." His words were kind, almost fatherly in tone. But I couldn't ignore the warmth they sparked in me. I knew I should leave it at that, let the thread of our connection unravel and fade. But deep down, I wasn't ready to let go. For the next few weeks, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Mark came home, full of stories about his trip, and I did my best to feign interest, nodding at the appropriate moments and asking the right questions. He didn't notice how distracted I was or how often my thoughts drifted to Peter. To his credit, he probably wouldn't have noticed even if I'd told him outright. Peter and I exchanged the occasional message, always brief and polite. He told me about his new apartment, a modest place near a park he liked to walk through in the mornings. I told him about the garden, how the flowers he'd helped me plant were thriving. The messages were innocent enough, but each one felt like a lifeline, tethering me to something I couldn't quite name. Then, one evening, as I sat alone in the living room while Mark worked late, my phone buzzed again. "Peter, how are you really?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The question was simple, but it struck a nerve. How was I really? Lonely, conflicted, adrift in a marriage that felt more like an obligation than a partnership. But I couldn't say that, not to Peter, not to anyone. Me, I'm fine. Busy, as always. Aha. It was a lie, of course, and I suspected Peter knew it. His reply came moments later. "Peter, you don't have to pretend with me, Emma. I know you better than that." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. Tears welled in my eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. How had he managed to see through me so effortlessly? How had he known what I couldn't even admit to myself? Before I could stop myself, I typed out a reply. I'm not fine. I haven't been fine for a long time." The truth hung in the air, raw and exposed, and for a moment I regretted sending it. But then his response came. "Peter, I'm here, Emma, always." The next time Mark left on a trip, I found myself spiraling again. The house felt suffocatingly empty, the loneliness gnawing at me until I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed Peter's number. "Emma," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, my grip tightening on the phone. "I don't know," I admitted. I needed someone to talk to." "I'm glad you called," he said, his tone gentle. "Tell me what's on your mind." For the next hour, I poured out everything I'd been holding inside, the distance between Mark and me, the sense of invisibility that had crept into my life, the guilt and confusion I felt about Peter. He listened without interruption, his steady presence on the other end of the line a balm to my frayed nerves. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. "Emma," he said softly, "you deserve more than this. You deserve to be happy." He let go of me for a second, and then he answered, softly, "Anna?" Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. "I don't even know what that looks like anymore," I whispered. "Then maybe it's time to figure it out," he said. "For yourself, not for Mark or for me. For you." His words lingered long after we hung up, a quiet echo in the stillness of the house. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that he might be right. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into self-reflection. I started journaling, trying to untangle the mess of emotions that had been building inside me for so long. I spent more time in the garden, finding solace in the simple act of tending to the flowers. And slowly, but surely, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that I had forgotten. Peter's messages continued, always supportive but never intrusive. He became my confidant, the one person I could be completely honest with. I knew it was dangerous, that our connection was a slippery slope, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Thanks to him, it was fine. Then, one day, he sent a message that made my heart skip a beat. "Peter, I'll be in town next week. Would you like to meet for coffee?" I stared at the screen, my emotions warring within me. Meeting Peter felt like crossing a line we'd worked so hard to redraw. But the thought of seeing him again, even in a public place, was intoxicating. Before I could overthink it, I typed out a reply. "Me? uh, okay. When and where?" The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked away on a quiet side street. I arrived early, my nerves jangling as I settled into a corner booth. Peter walked in moments later, his presence as commanding as ever. When he saw me, he smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made my heart ache. "Emma," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "It's good to see you." "You too," I said, my voice trembling slightly. For the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing: his apartment, my garden, the books we'd been reading. It was easy, natural, like slipping back into a rhythm we had never really lost. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered, unspoken but undeniable. When our conversation lulled, Peter reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. "I've missed you," he said, his voice low. My breath caught, the weight of his words settling over me. "I've missed you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there, the world around us fading away, the connection between us more palpable than ever. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. That evening, I stood in the garden, staring at the flowers Peter had helped me plant months ago. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender, the sun dipping low on the horizon. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a message from Peter. "Peter, you're always in my thoughts, Emma." Tears welled in my eyes as I read his words. I knew I was standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground beneath me crumbling with every step I took. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to turn back. As I stared at the message, the realization hit me with startling clarity. This wasn't just about Peter or Mark or the tangled web of emotions that had brought us to this point. This was about me, about what I wanted, what I needed, and the life I was no longer willing to settle for. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something I hadn't dared to hope for: possibility. The days that followed my meeting with Peter were a blur of heightened emotions and relentless introspection. Every moment spent with Mark felt hollow, his obliviousness a stark contrast to the whirlwind inside me. I found myself questioning everything: our marriage, our love, the life we had built together. Was it all an illusion I had convinced myself to live in, or had we genuinely grown apart so gradually that I hadn't noticed until someone else, someone like Peter, showed me what I was missing? I avoided Peter's messages for a few days, hoping that space would bring clarity, but it didn't. Instead, I found myself yearning for the simplicity of our conversations, the way he seemed to understand me without judgment. It felt like I had been starving for years, and Peter had offered me my first taste of sustenance. Mark, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging within me. One evening he came home early, a rare occurrence, and suggested we go out for dinner. I agreed, hoping the change of scenery might offer some perspective. We ended up at a small Italian restaurant, the kind of cozy, candlelit place that should have felt romantic but instead felt suffocating. As Mark droned on about his latest project, I sipped my wine and tried to focus on his words, but my mind kept drifting, images of Peter flashing through my thoughts like a reel I couldn't turn off. "Are you even listening, Emma?" Mark's voice broke through my haze, sharp and impatient. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, setting my glass down. "What were you saying?" He sighed, shaking his head. "You've been so distant lately. Is everything okay?" For a moment, I considered telling him the truth, or at least part of it, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in a web of fear and guilt. "I'm fine," I said instead, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." Mark didn't press further, but his expression made it clear he didn't believe me. Still, he returned to his meal, leaving me to stew in my own turmoil. That night, after Mark had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, my phone clutched in my hand. Peter's number hovered on the screen, my thumb poised over the call button. I told myself I was just looking for clarity, for someone to talk to. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. When he answered, his voice was warm and familiar, instantly calming the storm inside me. "Emma," he said, "is everything okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." "Talk to me," he said gently. "What's going on?" For the next hour, I poured out everything I had been holding inside. The loneliness, the confusion, the guilt. Peter listened without interruption, his steady presence on the other end of the line grounding me in a way Mark never could. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. "Emma," he said softly, "you can't keep living like this. You deserve more." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "I feel so stuck." "Then maybe it's time to get unstuck," he said. "You need to decide what you want, Emma. Not for Mark, not for me, for yourself." His words lingered long after we hung up, echoing in the quiet of the house. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of change. Malcolm. The next day, I woke with a sense of resolve I hadn't felt in years. I spent the morning cleaning the house, a physical act to match the emotional cleansing I was attempting. By the time Mark came home for lunch, I was ready. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves coiling in my stomach. Mark looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing. "About what?" "Us," I said simply. "Our marriage." He set down his fork, his expression shifting to one of concern. "Emma, what's going on? You've been acting strange for weeks." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Mark, I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Mark stared at me, his jaw tightening. "What are you saying? You want a divorce?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know something has to change. We can't keep living like this, Mark. It's not fair to either of us." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the table. "I thought we were fine," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the problem," I said, my voice breaking. "You didn't even notice." The conversation ended there, both of us retreating to separate corners of the house to process what had just happened. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life, but the weight of my decision pressed down on me like a heavy stone. The weeks that followed were a blur of tense conversations and quiet reflection. Mark and I agreed to try counseling, though neither of us seemed fully committed to the idea. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm that had grown too wide to bridge. During this time, Peter remained a constant presence in my life. Our messages continued, brief but comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't bring myself to cut him off. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden tending to the flowers Peter and I had planted together, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Peter, how are you holding up?" "Me. It's been hard, but I'm figuring it out." "Peter, I'm proud of you, Emma. You're stronger than you think." His words brought tears to my eyes, a mix of gratitude and longing swelling in my chest. I typed out a reply before I could second guess myself. Me. I wish you were here. The response came almost instantly. Peter, so do I. It wasn't until a few days later that I made the decision to see him again. Mark was away for the weekend, and the emptiness of the house was more than I could bear. I texted Peter, asking if he was free, and within an hour I was on my way to meet him. We chose a quiet park on the edge of town, a place where we could talk without fear of being seen. When I arrived, Peter was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He stood when he saw me, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "Emma," he said, his voice soft, "I'm glad you came." I nodded, my throat tightening as I took a seat beside him. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like my whole life is falling apart." Peter reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Sometimes things have to fall apart before they can come together," he said gently. I looked at him then, the sincerity in his eyes cutting through my fear. "I'm scared," I confessed. "So am I," he said, "but you're not alone, Emma. You never have to be alone." His words broke something in me. The dam of emotions I had been holding back for so long finally bursting. Tears streamed down my face, and Peter pulled me into his arms, holding me as I cried. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his gaze locking onto mine. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "I promise." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that no matter what came next, I would find a way through it. And maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to do it alone. The days that followed my meeting with Peter were filled with a mix of clarity and chaos. I had opened a door that I could never close again, and the path forward felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I knew that I couldn't continue living in limbo, caught between my loyalty to Mark and my growing connection with Peter. Something had to give. We were waiting for so much more than 30 seconds. Mark, oblivious to the shifting dynamics in my heart, continued his routines. Counseling sessions had started, but they felt mechanical, a box we were both checking off without any real intent to fix what was broken. I didn't resent him for it. If anything, I envied his ability to compartmentalize. But the gap between us grew wider with each passing day, and the weight of my choices pressed down on me like a constant shadow. It was on a quiet Sunday morning, as I sat in the garden sipping my coffee, that I made my decision. The sun was warm on my skin, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors, a testament to the care and attention Peter and I had poured into them. And that's when it hit me. I wanted to feel that sense of growth and renewal in my own life. I couldn't stay stagnant anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed Peter's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice instantly calming the nerves that had been building in my chest. "Emma," he said, "is everything okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I need to talk to you. In person." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the concern in his silence. "Of course," he said finally. "When and where?" "When?" We met that afternoon at the same park as before, beneath the sprawling oak tree that had become our unspoken meeting place. Peter was already there when I arrived, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. When he saw me, he smiled, a small, tentative smile that made my heart ache. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," he replied, his tone gentle. We sat side by side on the bench, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing on the swings. "I can't keep living like this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm trapped in a life that isn't mine." Peter turned to me, his gaze steady. "Then it's time to take it back, Emma. You deserve to be happy." The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. "I don't even know where to start," I confessed. "Start with what feels right," he said. "What your heart is telling you." I looked at him, the depth of his sincerity cutting through my fear. "Peter," I said, my voice trembling, "I think I'm falling for you." His eyes softened, a mix of sadness and hope flickering across his face. "Emma," he said, reaching for my hand, "you have no idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that." The warmth of his touch steadied me, grounding me in the moment. "What do we do now?" I asked, the enormity of the situation sinking in. "We take it one step at a time," he said, "but only if you're sure. I don't want you to do this unless it's what you truly want." I nodded, the weight of my decision settling over me. "I am sure," I said. "I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Peter's hand tightened around mine, his gaze filled with determination. "Then we'll figure it out together." The conversation with Mark that evening was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He came home late, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched across his face. As he sat down at the kitchen table, I joined him, my hands shaking as I clasped them together. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "Is this about counseling again? Because I think we're making progress." "No," I interrupted, my throat tightening. "It's not about counseling. It's about us." Mark's expression shifted, the realization dawning in his eyes. "Emma," he said slowly, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that we're happy, that this marriage is working. It's not." His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "So what? You want a divorce?" Tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded. "I think it's the best thing for both of us." Mark stared at me, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "Is there someone else?" he demanded. The question hit me like a slap, the truth catching in my throat. I wanted to deny it, to spare him the pain, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. "Yes," I said softly, the word hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Mark pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. "I can't believe this," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "How long?" "It's not what you think," I said quickly. "Nothing happened until after I realized our marriage was already broken." "That doesn't make it better, Emma," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You betrayed me." The weight of his words crushed me, the guilt and shame threatening to consume me. But beneath it all was a flicker of resolve, a determination to finally be honest, no matter the cost. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you, Mark, but I can't keep living a lie." He stared at me for a long moment, his chest heaving with emotion. Finally, he grabbed his keys and stormed out, the slam of the front door echoing through the house. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence oppressive, the reality of what I had just done sinking in. I had crossed a line that there was no coming back from, and the weight of it was overwhelming. But somewhere deep inside, there was a spark of relief. I had finally taken the first step toward a life that was mine, no matter how painful the journey might be. In the weeks that followed, Mark and I began the process of untangling our lives. It was messy and emotional, filled with arguments and tears. But amid the chaos, I found moments of clarity, glimpses of the person I was rediscovering. Peter remained a steady presence, his support unwavering as I navigated the fallout. We took things slowly, cautious not to rush into anything that might compound the hurt we had already caused. But our connection deepened, rooted in the honesty and vulnerability that had brought us together in the first place. One evening, as we sat together in his small apartment, Peter reached for my hand, his gaze searching mine. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft. I thought about the question, the weight of it settling over me. My life was far from perfect, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that I could build something new, something real. "Yes," I said, a smile breaking across my face. "I think I am." Peter's eyes softened, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You deserve that, Emma, more than anything." As I leaned into his embrace, the warmth of his presence grounding me, I realized that happiness wasn't about perfection. It was about finding the courage to choose a life that felt true, even when it meant facing the consequences. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally choosing myself. The aftermath of my conversation with Mark left me emotionally drained, yet oddly liberated. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't pretending anymore. The walls of my marriage had crumbled, and while the wreckage was painful to sift through, it also revealed the foundation I needed to start anew. Mark stayed at a hotel for a few days after our confrontation, giving us both space to process. The silence in the house was different now, less suffocating, more reflective. I spent the time journaling, walking in the garden, and trying to reconcile my guilt with the truth of what I wanted. The decision to end my marriage wasn't something I'd taken lightly, but deep down I knew it was the right one. When Mark finally returned, it was to discuss the practicalities of moving forward. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where our life together had once felt so full of promise. Now, it was just a place where two people divided a life that no longer fit. "I've spoken to a lawyer," Mark said, his voice tight. "I'll make sure everything is fair." "I don't want this to be ugly," I said, my tone soft but firm. "I still care about you, Mark. I always will." He looked at me then, his expression a mix of hurt and resignation. "Do you love him?" he asked, the question cutting through the air like a knife. I hesitated, not wanting to add salt to the wound, but I owed him the truth. "I don't know what the future holds," I said carefully. "But I know this isn't about Peter. It's about us. About me. And I think we both deserve more than what we've become." Mark nodded slowly, his jaw clenching as he processed my words. I wish things had been different," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "But maybe you're right. Maybe we both deserve more." It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was honest, and that felt like a small victory. By the end of the week, Mark had moved out, leaving the house eerily empty, yet filled with a strange sense of possibility. Peter remained a steady presence in my life during this time, though we were careful not to rush into anything. He understood that I needed to heal, to rediscover myself before we could even think about what a relationship between us might look like. His patience was a balm to my frayed nerves, his quiet support a reminder that I wasn't alone. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Peter, how are you feeling today?" I smiled, the simple question warming my heart. His response came quickly. "Peter, that's good to hear. You've been through a lot, Emma. Be kind to yourself." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, an acknowledgement that while the road ahead was uncertain, it was also filled with the possibility of something new. The months that followed were a mix of challenges and growth. The divorce process was as amicable as it could be, though there were moments of tension and sadness that reminded me of what we were leaving behind. Mark and I divided our assets, sold the house, and went our separate ways. It was bittersweet, but it also felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. And no. Peter and I kept our connection alive through quiet moments and simple gestures. He would send me messages of encouragement, little reminders that I wasn't alone. We met for coffee occasionally, always keeping things low-key, allowing our bond to grow naturally. There was no rush, no pressure, just a mutual understanding that we were navigating something delicate and meaningful. One afternoon, as we walked through the park where we had first reconnected, Peter turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "How are you really doing, Emma?" he asked, his voice gentle. I paused, considering his question. "I think I'm okay," I said honestly. "I'm still figuring things out, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to feel that way," he said. I looked at him, the warmth in his eyes making my chest tighten. "You've been a big part of that, Peter. I hope you know that." His smile deepened, his hand brushing mine as we continued walking. "I'm just glad I could be here for you," he said simply. And then, everything went blank. As time went on, our relationship began to take shape in ways that felt organic and right. We started spending more time together, sharing meals, going on walks, and talking late into the night. It was easy, comfortable, like finding a rhythm we'd always known but had never allowed ourselves to embrace. One evening, as we sat on his couch watching a movie, he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Emma," he said softly, his tone serious, "I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm here. I don't want you to feel like you have to rush into anything for my sake." I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't feel rushed," I said. "If anything, I feel like I'm finally moving at the right pace." His eyes softened, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "I'm glad," he said, "because you're worth waiting for." The weight of his words settled over me, filling me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future, not one dictated by obligation or appearances, but one built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. The day my divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. That evening, Peter invited me over for dinner. He greeted me at the door with a warm smile, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice full of concern. I'm okay, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. It's a lot to process, but I think I'm ready to move forward. Peter's smile widened, his hands resting on my shoulders. Then let's move forward together, he said. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that was possible. In the weeks and months that followed, Peter and I built a life together, one small step at a time. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of doubt and fear. But it was real, grounded in the connection we had fought so hard to protect. As I stood in the garden one morning, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors around me, I realized that I had found what I had been searching for all along. Not just love, but a sense of self, a belief that I deserved to be happy. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally living the life I was meant to have.